Hello, everyone, and welcome to our brand new series, Ranked the Presidents. This is episode 1, the beginning, where we will be discussing the Washington administration, so 8 years. And we're going to have an episode either weekly or bi-weekly from this point forward, going over each presidential administration. Sometimes we're going to cover 2 up to 3 presidents in one episode, depending on the significance of their administration. But we decided that Washington deserved his own episode alone. So I'll throw it around the horn. I'm Harrison. I'll be acting as host, and I have my 2 special guests here. If you could introduce yourselves.
I'll let Sarah go first.
Okay.
I'm Sarah. As you can tell by the accent, I'm from the UK, and I'll be ranking Washington very low for taking you away from our beloved monarchy.
And Eric?
Yeah, I'm Eric. I'm the editor-in-chief here at Elections Daily. You've probably seen me before, so not a whole lot to go over, but I'm very excited to get into the series and this more historical content.
Yep, it's very exciting. So today we're talking, obviously, about George Washington, the first president of the United States. So he was born unto a wealthy Virginia planter family on February 22nd, 1732. And at that point, he was the 4th generation of his family to be living in the American colonies. His great-grandfather emigrated from England in 1656 from Northamptonshire, and they had lived in Virginia, again, for nearly a century at the time he was born. He's well known today for his service. I mean, initially he served under Great Britain in the Virginia militia, and eventually came to prominence as the leader of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and that catapulted him into the presidency. And notably, for those of you who are interested in elections, the first 2 elections were unopposed. And that didn't happen again until 1820 with James Monroe, who was reelected unopposed. So those are really his elections combined with the Monroe reelection, really the 3 elections where we've had a president that was truly unopposed in the literal sense.
Mm-hmm. So, and the only president to not be affiliated with a political party.
That is also true, which is interesting. And Washington was very keen on making sure that political parties would not come to dominate American politics, which is something that obviously did not play out properly. And Washington was also notable in that he really didn't per se want the job. I've written a paper on this before talking about his disinterestedness. So he was keen on serving the country, but he wasn't serving for personal ambition, which is pretty much why at the end of the day he ended up deciding to step down after 2 terms. Even though the public would have almost certainly approved of his serving more terms, he was determined to set that precedent, which essentially held up. Although we did have Grant try to seek a 3rd term and fail at the convention. Teddy Roosevelt tried to get a 2nd full term non-consecutive, or a 3rd full term non-consecutively, and eventually the precedent was broken by FDR, but it still held true for quite a long time. So he was inaugurated on April the 30th, 1789, and he felt that he was willing to execute his role as president for the people that had chosen him. And his presidency ended on March 4th, 1797, after 2 terms, because in the past, the president would swear in on March 4th, not January 20th. I'll throw it to Sarah first. Do you have any introductory thoughts on Washington as a person before we get into his presidency?
A great book recommendation, if you want to read more about him, is George Washington by Ron Chernow, who also wrote the book Hamilton, which the musical is based on, and a book about Ulysses S. Grant, which I actually haven't read. And they did a mini-series on both of those. He was very much singular in his generation. When we look at the founding fathers, Hamilton, Jefferson, Adams, Jay, Franklin, Burr, all very educated. They went to Harvard, Princeton, exclusively. They were polyglots, interested in science and philosophy. Particularly Jefferson had a huge impact. I mean, he invented the swivel chair. He brought the tomato over. Washington was singular in that he wasn't an academic. He wasn't stupid by any means. He was tutored at home, but he was not an academic. He was military, which would pave the way for later ones, such as Zachary Taylor, Dwight Eisenhower, Ulysses S. Grant. And that what I think is the important thing to notice, because Adams and Jefferson both had the problem that they were seen as quite stiff and uninterested. But I think that worked in Washington's favour, because everyone expects a war hero to be a bit dignified and regal. He wasn't a nasty person, but he was very antisocial. He wasn't the life of the party, as Ben Franklin was.
Mm-hmm. And Eric?
Yeah, I mean, his background is obviously really fascinating. Kind of the circumstances and things he was in. What I find really interesting is that one, his first election, there were actually two states that had not ratified the Constitution by this point: North Carolina and Rhode Island did not actually vote in the first election because we were lagging behind in the process in North Carolina, and then Rhode Island seemed completely disinterested until everyone else had done everything. But people like him being in charge, I think, gave a lot more confidence to this new form of government. Obviously, there had been the Articles of Confederation beforehand, which had proven to be fairly disastrous in terms of creating a centralized government that was capable of doing anything. This new system, at least with Washington in charge, had someone everyone trusted, someone who they didn't fear would take more power. He basically had the opportunity to become a monarch if he wanted after the Revolutionary War. He very well could have. He chose not only to not do that, but to go home, to sit out a lot of this process. So having someone like him, I think, really did influence a lot of these states that were more skeptical, the anti-federalists, that this system was something that they could trust, at least for now, and that with Washington they had someone who was not going to be a repeat of what they had encountered before under the monarchy.
Mm-hmm. In many ways, both prior to his assuming the role of president and during his administration, he could have been described as a great mediator because there were quite a few notable conflicts that we'll get into that occurred during his administration. So before we get into the important salient events of his administration, full 8 years, we'll be discussing his cabinet because I think it's important to start off each presidential administration by discussing the cabinet. And I especially think it's important to discuss Washington's cabinet because it was the first cabinet and it's another precedent that Washington set because in the Constitution, nowhere in the Constitution does it indicate that a cabinet is required or that it should even exist at all. In many respects, Washington's first administration laid the foundation for what would continue on to this day as a critical part of American politics, essentially the Presidential Advisory Board, if you'd like to call it that. First off, his vice president was John Adams. Prior to the 12th Amendment, which was ratified after the election of 1800, electors would vote twice, and there was no distinction made between the vote for president and vice president. So the second place finisher, if you will, that's the simplest way I could describe it, in the tally would become vice president, and that was John Adams. The Secretary of State, there were quite a few Secretary of States. There were 4 of them. John Jay was briefly Secretary of State before finding himself in his role at the Supreme Court, which was also brand new at this point. For 3 years, Thomas Jefferson was a Secretary of State from 1790 to 1793. And then 2 brief Secretary of States, Edmund Randolph and Timothy Pickering, closed out his administration. When it comes to the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton ran the Treasury for the bulk of his administration up until 1795. You may remember the Hamilton Financial Plan. And that's really one of the first big Jefferson-Hamilton feuds. And then briefly, Oliver Wolcott Jr. served as the Secretary of the Treasury. Secretary of War, the second to last position, was held by Henry Knox for his first term, another prominent commander during the Revolution, and closed out by James McHenry in the final year. And then Attorney General, responsible for what was at that point the early Justice Department. Edmund Randolph carried through for most of his first term. And then William Bradford and Charles Lee closed out his second term. So, Sarah, do you have anything important you'd like to add on these cabinet officials and really the beginning of the cabinet? And you can even discuss feuds or arguments that the viewers may find interesting.
Well, hopefully there will be many watching who, like me, are a huge fan of the hit musical Hamilton, which does discuss this, obviously a bit of a condensed version. But sort of the key points of it, there's the Cabinet Battle 1 and Cabinet Battle 2, which is a rap version of how a cabinet battle would play out, as well as Thomas Jefferson arriving and James Madison telling him this guy Hamilton is loco. So yeah, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, very different people. Alexander Hamilton was exuberant, excitable, in his own words, young, scrappy and hungry. Thomas Jefferson was a bit more staid. He'd lived most of his life in France. Very different people. Jefferson came from a prominent family. Alexander was an illegitimate child who was partially not white, which would have been a huge deal back then. And they disagreed on financials. Alexander Hamilton wanted a centralized system where the federal government was short state states. Jefferson wanted individuals, especially for the South and for Virginia, because they were the ones that were doing well. And this led to a lot of tension. So you can imagine how thrilled Jefferson was when the Reynolds pamphlet came out, because that destroyed Alexander Hamilton's chances of being president, even though Thomas Jefferson was raping his underage slave. But again, that probably did not matter too much. And then we throw into the mix John Adams, who was, I personally like him and his wife, but he was very arrogant, very snobby. Not many vice presidents and presidents get on. The only two I can actually think of who liked each other were Carter and Mondale as friends. Washington basically excluded Adams from the situation. Adams did not like that at all and whinged for the entirety of the 2 terms. But the thing about Washington was he stayed above it. He was like, I'm this army general. I'm older than these men. I'm a father figure to them. I'm not going to play favourites. I'm not going to have sides. And that is, I think, is why he is well remembered. He was independent both in party and in spirit. I do believe that he may have been interested in Alexander Hamilton's reforms, but it was pretty hands-off about it. He was like, okay, I'm going to be president, but you guys are going to make the decision. This isn't my doing.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, I think one thing you could touch on is maybe if you look at these early cabinet feuds, they kind of represent what would eventually devolve in to the first political party system in the United States.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it obviously, you have a couple of years where, for the most part, historians in hindsight now refer to this as the pro-administration and the anti-administration party. That's generally the broad term they use for the rough groupings in the House and the Senate. Obviously, John Adams was sympathetic to Washington and more broadly sympathetic to Alexander Hamilton, would later join his Federalist Party and become the first and only Federalist president. In fact, the only Federalist candidate other than, I believe, the Federalist candidate in 1812 who would manage to run even a competent, semi close to winning presidential campaign. So on that end, you obviously have the huge impact of Alexander Hamilton early on in this administration, which really kind of led a lot of the policy, even though Washington was broadly above a lot of the conflict. But ultimately, the party that would turn out to be dominant would be the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, which were this agrarian party. They also had major differences even externally. The Federalists remained sympathetic not to the monarchy, but to Britain. They wanted to have closer relations with the United Kingdom, which is probably a fairly wise idea given the sway of history at that point. The Democratic Republicans were more broadly sympathetic to France, which obviously makes sense given France's support of the United States, but given how France almost immediately descended into their own revolution, which was not nearly as successful as the American one, to put it lightly, proved to be a pretty bad idea in hindsight. A lot of these conflicts that you see later, the quasi-war, the conflict between Adams and Jefferson, the British, the War of 1812 even, a lot of these do ultimately stem from policies that came from the Washington administration. They're not on him, but they're simply natural outgrowings of a cabinet that was not made for ideological balance, ultimately sorting themselves and figuring out what direction they wanted to take. Not a country that wasn't new at this point, it had been around, but a new government with substantial new powers that were not available to it under the Articles of Confederation, which certainly would not have allowed for the extensive infrastructure programs and nation building that Hamilton in particular was a really big fan of.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to note as well that the Constitution did lay out the process by which presidential nominees could be confirmed, but it was still really a precedent set by Washington in terms of creating such a cabinet. And over time, you ended up seeing more roles added to the cabinet, but the foundation roles, if you will, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, and Attorney General, really continued to be, and even to this day, are some of the most important positions in the American government. But moving on to his administration, after he made John Jay the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, following the Judiciary Act of 1789, one of the early debates of his administration in terms of a domestic affairs issue was the debate over where to put a permanent U.S. capital. And ultimately, it was decided that the capital would be where it is today in Washington City, which is what it was called for quite a long time. I'm just trying to make sure that we can cover all of the big things here. But do you have any comments on that? Because Sarah, at all, the selection of the capital debate? I'm not sure if you.
Well, this is again something I learned from Hamilton and the book, which I also recommend because obviously Hamilton was in the cabinet, so it covers like a lot of that. It was decided between James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, and they call it in the musical they call it the room where it happens because nobody knows what was actually said there and what was done. But they basically said, okay, you can have it in around the Potomac as opposed to New York where Hamilton wanted and Virginia where Madison and Jefferson did.
Mm-hmm.
And then in return, he'll get the banks. So that was how it worked. Again, this was nothing to do with Washington. This was another one of him being above it all because frankly, all he wanted to do was probably get back to Mount Vernon and live his life. He didn't care where the capital was because he probably wasn't going to really go to it afterwards. This was more for the people who would be continuing politics, and so Alexander Hamilton remained prominent until his 1804 death. Jefferson and Madison were both two-term presidents.
Mm-hmm. And it's important to note as well that Washington was the single president who did not live in the White House because construction wasn't finished until around November 1800, which was just in time for John Adams to move into the White House. Prior to the capital selection, the temporary capital had technically been New York City. But even then, they never intended that to be the permanent capital. So it was one of the first big domestic policy moments of the administration up to that point.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's had massive ramifications on American history. I mean, you think about it, just for example, in terms of regionality. New York was an already established city. Philadelphia was an already established city. You're putting the capital there. That's not a whole lot changes. There's going to be outgrowth from people moving to it and going to and from, but it doesn't radically change an area. Putting it in D.C. has allowed basically a metropolis to be built there. The vision of it from the French designer who was tasked with planning it was of a grand planned city similar to Paris. I don't think we ultimately created a city comparable to Paris, but what it did do was create a city in the middle of a swamp, basically, that's become one of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. Obviously, that area, on the Virginia-Maryland border does have strategic value and value as a location, but it'd be an interesting counterfactual to think about what that area would look like today if we hadn't built the capital, or if we instead put it in New York, or we put it in Philadelphia, or mm-hmm. Those would have been the main two, or Boston even.
One of the... Sorry.
Yeah, you would have seen a very different, I think, just a way of developing what it means to be the capital and how that naturally develops compared to what we see right now.
Mm-hmm. And the Washington administration at its onset was also notable for presiding over the implementation of the tariff of 1789, which up to that point was really the first way in which the federal government would raise revenue based off of the importation of goods by essentially placing the tariff on foreign goods. And eventually the tariff debate would come to define the political dichotomy in the 19th century as well. And you ended up with individuals, particularly the Republican Party eventually by the end of the 19th century, was frequently promoting tariffs on the argument that they would not only benefit American industry, it would be a great way to fund the government, essentially in a form of revenue. Because you have to remember at this point, under the Washington administration, taxes, like direct taxes, those did not really exist. So Congress used tariffs to essentially fill its coffers, mostly on goods imported from Britain up to that point. And that spiraled into the Hamilton economic program, the financial plan, which Sarah discussed earlier. So for the sake of time, we'll be moving on to what might be the seminal domestic policy issue in administration, somewhat dominated by foreign policy issues, the Whiskey Rebellion. And it's notable because you really would not see a president ever decide to get in uniform, get up on his horse, and ride out and settle a rebellion. I mean, that's just straight up George Washington, if you think about it. Nothing more George Washington than that, showing that in many respects, he was not just a president, but a general. And in many respects, further than that his time as a general had influenced him more than when he was president. So the Whiskey Rebellion came from the Distilled Spirit Duties Act, which was known as the Whiskey Act. And that became law in 1791. And it was essentially a direct tax levied on distilled spirits. So that is why it's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. And frankly, there was an armed insurrection over the implementation of this tax in Western Pennsylvania, and Washington ultimately rode out and helped to quell this rebellion. And ultimately, he established the principle that the federal law is the supreme law of the land. So once again, another precedent. And I think it was good at that point to establish such a precedent with a president like Washington by the side of the federal law of the United States government, because he could very easily enforce it. He was well respected, beloved, if you will, and he had a strong image. So would you like to comment on this? I'll throw it to anyone who wants to say anything. I think it's an important event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's obviously a seminal moment in kind of the development of the power of the presidency. It's also incredibly bizarre in hindsight to see a president actively leading the military, even though the president in the Constitution is explicitly given that authority to commander-in-chief. It's kind of fitting that Washington is only one of two presidents to have actually exercised that authority, to the nominal authority they have. And although now there's no possibility you'd see a president anywhere near a battlefield. Back then, I think it set a pretty clear image in terms of it. I think it probably also helped sway some minds. Again, Washington's really, really well respected by pretty much everyone. You have him personally doing something like this, gives it a little bit of credibility. But it is very, very weird in hindsight to have a president literally leading the military, as opposed to figuratively and policy-wise leading the military.
Do you have any comments on this, Sarah, with relation to his image and how that influenced the public's perception of his presidency?
Well, I don't think this isn't necessarily linked to the Whiskey Rebellion, but there was a very famous case where officers were basically wanting to form a mutiny over pay. Conspiracy. I can't remember the year, but I know it was March 15th because it's my birthday, and that's why I remember it. He famously took out his glasses and he was getting grey and old and saying, "Forgive me for I've grown both blind and wary at the cause of liberty," or something to that effect. And it moved the men to tears. And that, basically what you both said, is how incredible, or how they must have thought of him. You know, he initially sent Hamilton to sort it out. Obviously, it probably didn't go well. And there was a really good podcast about it. I think it's American History Tales by Lindsey Graham. It's one of the Sarahs, and it's really interesting. And
I would highly recommend all of the Lindsey Graham podcasts.
Oh, they're so good.
They love all of them. I listened to at least 3 of them.
Yeah, they are great. I do recommend them, definitely. So it shows that Washington was so well respected that, I mean, can you imagine, if there was protest over COVID restrictions and Joe Biden came riding up on a horse in the middle of DC? First of all, that would be amazing and hilarious. But this has got. You used to have presidents who were generals, Taylor, Jackson, etc. And we haven't really had any wartime presidents since, Bush Senior, and he wasn't really career military. He was there for World War II, same with Reagan and the others.
More career diplomatic foreign policy standpoint. And then CIA, which is kind of
I mean, the only other people I could see doing that, I know Madison technically was technically on horseback during a battle during the War of 1812. Doesn't really count. The only other people I could see doing that.
It's very hard to imagine Madison being on a horse in battle, given his.
I could see Grant doing it. I could see Teddy Roosevelt doing it. I could maybe see Trump doing it for the fun. Trump would absolutely get on a horse.
If you wanted to pay to see that.
But moving on, since we have to stay on schedule, really the last thing that we can talk about now that we've talked about domestic policy, I would talk about foreign affairs. And this administration was very much, even the Adams administration after it, they were both very much dominated by foreign affairs issues over domestic policy issues. So France, again, had been essentially the number one ally of the United States during the Revolutionary War. And Jefferson was keen on noting that. And eventually the Democratic Republicans would come to power and they would very much support continuing relationship with France, except there was a wrench thrown in the Franco-American relationship, if you will, and that was the French Revolution. So the Bastille was stormed the same year that George Washington would enter the White House in 1789. And that sparked the French Revolution, which, as Eric mentioned, was longer and bloodier than our revolution and not nearly as successful at all, considering pretty much everything they did accomplish was put back in place a little under 2 decades later with the Bourbon Restoration. But this was one of the, essentially, It's hard to note the scale of our relationship with France because there are so many issues that would come to develop between France and the United States over the next two administrations, notably the Quasi-War. So I think what I'm going to do is just maybe talk to Sarah a bit about how the French Revolution impacted a change in relations between the United States and France and how that impacted the way that Washington and his administration governed.
Well, there's a fantastic quote. Now, I cannot remember for the life of me who said it, but an American diplomat is in London and he goes to the toilet. And right in front of the toilet is a picture of George Washington. And the joke goes, nothing makes an Englishman shit like the sight of George Washington. That sums up the English version. Now, I can't say I'm too well versed in the French Revolution. Apparently, every school in Britain did it for history, but ours didn't for some reason. But the French Revolution, obviously very interesting. You had even the leaders of it, like Robespierre, eventually cut off. You had the rise of Napoleon. You later had the rebellion that was in Les Mis, but I don't know what it's called now. It's from a rebellion from Les Mis. Yeah, France could have been... I mean, France, with a monarchy without, probably would have supported it. For the monarchy side, it's to get back at Britain. For the non-monarchy thing, it's, oh, they got rid of their monarchy. We can do the same thing. But obviously, France it turned into complete anarchy. You had people on all sides murdered. But France was so important because when you look at geopolitics at that point, it was basically Britain versus France. Maybe, Spain with the New World, but that didn't really affect it globally. So I think the French Revolution definitely put a spanner in the works there. And it sort of became over the years, it came a toss of who's the USA's bestest buddy. And I don't think they've been their bestest buddy since probably at least like the 19th century. I mean, they're technically we've got a special relationship, but obviously that is controversial at least.
And it's notable because the U.S. government was put in a tricky place essentially with this, and Washington knew it, given his military background. He knew that the United States militarily and financially wasn't ready to fight, another war. And eventually the Napoleonic Wars would brew at the turn of the century between the United Kingdom and France. But though many in the United States were sympathetic to the plight of the French revolutionaries, he knew as president that the United States really couldn't afford to get involved and therefore implemented essentially a policy of neutrality. And that would really continue to echo even to the end of his administration with the farewell address. So the cabinet basically confirmed Washington's decision to issue a proclamation of neutrality right at the beginning of his second term. And that was issued in 1793 at the heart of the revolution and the conflict between Great Britain and France. And that proclamation eventually became law in 1794, and it really did govern the remainder of his administration in the last 2 years. In fact, people in the press would frankly often call Washington a pacifist. And in many respects, I think that was important for early America because even another decade and a half down the line, I would not by any means say the War of 1812 was an easy victory. So the idea of being involved in another war when we hadn't even paid off debts from the Revolutionary War would have really shaken America to its core at that point. So I think it was wise of Washington to support a policy of neutrality. And I guess, you can mention it real quickly, but to stay on course, I wanted to briefly touch on relations with Great Britain as well.
Yeah. All I was going to say is that I think it was the wise decision to stay out. And I think in hindsight, it was pretty clear the French intervention in the Revolutionary War was not altruistic. It was not like the French had some great love for the American people and for republicanism. They were the most monarchical of monarchies in Europe. It was mainly to get back at the British. So I think while the Americans were broadly sympathetic to the idea of the revolution that started, in hindsight, American intervention, not getting involved in the French Revolutionary War and all that came after it was evidently the wise decision. It was an incredibly wise decision not to get anywhere near that mess because we didn't have the resources for it. And frankly, it would have been really strange to go after the government, honestly, that had supported us because it's a weird position all around.
Mm-hmm. So looking at the relationships with Great Britain, one of the big issues that took place after the war wasn't necessarily a form of direct conflict between Great Britain and the United States. It largely dealt with French shipping. So besides getting a lot of goods imported from Britain that were then tariff taxed, essentially, the United States relied heavily on France as an ally for shipping for various things, foodstuffs and supplies and the like. So ultimately, you could say the dual trade between the Americas and France, which mutually benefited both countries. The British Navy, since it was at war with France, would cut off that supply in an attempt to disrupt the trade between France and the United States. And though this was certainly targeted at stopping France, it indirectly hurt the United States. And at the time, thinkers like James Madison and other supporters of his movement called for economic retaliation against Britain for doing that because it was damaging the American economy almost as much as the French economy. And he at one point called for a trade embargo with Britain, which didn't take place because the United States was still receiving imports from Britain, and most of the government's money was made off of tariffs on those imports. Nonetheless, Congress did temporarily pass an embargo. Eventually, however, we got the Jay Treaty, which is famous for a variety of reasons. John Jay called the treaty equal and fair, and essentially it was sought out in an attempt to garner compensation for the seizure of American ships and to clarify the rules governing trade and the British seizure of neutral ships, particularly in that conflict between France and England. Essentially, it was designed to lessen the burden on the United States simply by being associated, whether good or bad, with both countries. So there were some other parts of the administration. He dealt with the Barbary pirates, which eventually you would go on to see the introduction of the Marine Corps as a hybrid land and naval unit to take out the Barbary pirates. And you had a relationship with Spain that would eventually, over the next 2 decades, allow Florida to be admitted into the United States as a state. So at this point, it was still very, very early. The Louisiana Purchase hadn't even happened yet, wasn't even in anybody's mind. And Florida was still firmly occupied by the Spanish. Nonetheless, I would say that the relationships between the different countries, I would say that the one with Spain was probably least rocky, but still pretty chaotic. So I'll throw it to Sarah. Do you have anything to say on British-American relations at this point with Washington?
Well, obviously, I further go back to the anecdote earlier about the George Washington over the toilet. I don't think he was as sort of, I don't want to say unimportant, but necessary to relations in the way that Adams and Jefferson, who both spent quite a bit of time in Great Britain, specifically London, did. I mean, one of your first ladies, Louisa Adams, she was born here. So a bit later on, we had some friendship. But I think probably the relationship with France was more important in the Washington administration. Whether that relationship with France became more important with others later on, no. But I think predominantly it was more of a Great Britain was trying to cut its losses. We would later focus on India. Sort of, it wasn't until later that sort of the British Empire under Queen Victoria really reigned. I think it was just about licking our wounds. Mm-hmm. But I think probably most British people, I mean, the ordinary person was like, so I don't think.
Yeah. And I should note also that impressment, which was one of the causes of the War of 1812, had not started yet. This was more sieging ships that were trading between France and the United States. But like you said, Great Britain was more so targeting France, not the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's ironic that the greatest reaches of the British Empire, the Pax Britannia, as it is called, happened after the British finally moved on from the Americas, which had proven to be kind of a raw deal in a lot of ways, aside from Canada, which, I mean, it's not as good as India or like Africa. If you're going to look for colonial possessions, like you'd much rather have the industrial production of Africa or the population of it. Like moving on from that enabled both Britain and America to really reach where they were. And I think it turned out to be the right thing in hindsight. It's just a shame it took so long and took a fairly useless war in the War of 1812. I mean, the only people that nobody won in the War of 1812. The only people that lost were Spain because they lost
Might
Florida.
As well say that Andrew Jackson won, because even though the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, that helped him catapult his political career a little under a decade after. But now we've reached the point where we get to rate George Washington and give a brief description about why we're doing the rating. So I will give George Washington an A, because we're doing an A through F scale. Pretty much because it was such a precarious time in American history. It literally was the first president. So you didn't really have room for someone who was overly ambitious or self-driven. And I really think, regardless of even looking at Washington stressing nonpartisan direction in American politics and stressing staying out of foreign conflicts and focusing mostly on domestic issues. I would say that having a general, having someone who had that leadership experience, someone who could be a great mediator and set all these important precedents that were essentially designed to combat excess, are very important, because I feel like if our first president had been someone idealistic or self-centered to too great of an extent, then we could have set dangerous precedents that would have made the presidency an exuberant office long term that could have really shaken the foundations of the country and potentially instilled a monarch in the United States, because someone could have very well held on to power. So I think he's important for that. Certainly one of the better presidents. Eric?
I would give him an A as well, and he would at least be at the very minimum my top 5. I think I usually have him in my top 2 or 3, if not number 1. Few presidents or few leaders can lay claim to what Washington did while not being overstated, loud public figures. He effectively led a new system of government, a republic, that had not been attempted with a strong executive. He'd stayed out of the fray of partisan politics. He'd navigated the stresses of having to deal with North and South, having to deal with France and the UK and whatever Spain was doing, dealing with the Indian or Native American crisis, as we call them now, out in the West, dealing with so many different things, the admission of states, the creation of the cabinet, most of our basic forms of government, the traditions and things the presidents do today, a lot of them date back to Washington. And to leave such a positive legacy on that end is a really good thing. And I do find it admirable that he did leave office after 2 terms. I think it's a good tradition to have. I think it's a good thing to have in the Constitution, to not have this executive an executive branch that is ceding or gaining so much power for itself. I think it's dangerous. We're sliding more into a more powerful executive. I'm from North Carolina. We have one of the weakest executives in the country. But even our executive has a cabinet. It has a lot of these same sort of traditions that Washington does. So it's really hard to understate how important Washington is, and how successful his presidency really was, even if he did weirdly kind of pick the losing side of the Federalist Democratic Republican struggle.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I'd also like to briefly drop in that George Washington did inadvertently start a war, the French-Indian War, when him as an Indians attacked what turned out to be a French peace envoy. I mean, he was pre-president, but I just find that funny.
That is a funny story they taught us in history.
Another one that is really great. I'd give him an A-. The British in me wants to give him a minus because the whole monarchy thing, and we should have still kept you or whatever. He was the right man for the right time. They needed somebody who was dignified, who was above party politics to lead this new system. And I think one of the most important parts of his legacy that we haven't really touched upon is, well, we touched upon the fact that George Washington didn't want to be president. But until maybe the time of McKinley Roosevelt, you weren't expected to want to be president. It was seen as unbecoming of a gentleman to want to be president. You weren't supposed to campaign. You had people to do that for you. And that is something that lasted a good century. And yeah, today it's the complete opposite. It's rallies and everything. But yeah, it was definitely the right time. I think, again, Eric touched on about France, him not going into France was a good idea. And frankly, I completely agree. So I'd give probably an AA-. Historically, he's usually ranked at number 1, sort of going along with Roosevelt and Lincoln. And I think he'll probably always remain that way. We have seen presidents change, like Andrew Jackson's policy against Indians, for example, has catapulted him down, etc., etc. But I think his legacy is that he will always be probably the greatest president.
The president's president, the one, I mean, to this day, I mean, he's so respected here that we posthumously in the 1970s declared him the general of the armies of the United States forever.
And so nobody can outrank him, can they?
Which is kind of very strange when you think about it, but that's the level of respect he's held to here. That, at least in terms of rank, I think there's no American that's seen more favorably, at least traditionally, than Washington as like this model statesman and a general, and to some degree a personal, though obviously some of the personal aspects have been rightly dissected in recent years in relationship.
That's with all presidents as well. We're discussing their presidencies, not who they are as people. So these grades don't necessarily reflect the quality of their characters, for example.
Mm-hmm. Although I think in most regards, Washington would rank fairly highly in a lot of those categories you do look for.
I think that his character would be perceived, with higher regard than someone like Jefferson or Jackson by a modern perspective.
Yeah, almost certainly.
Jackson was fun. He was an idiot. I mean, it could be pretty horrible, but it was really entertaining. Come on, it's one of the most entertaining ones before Roosevelt. And it's my birthday twin, so I have to like him.
Yeah, one of those only in America stories of how you get a president with a bullet that's stuck in his body from a duel for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I'll give it to you guys. We've had some amazing ones. It's like Henry VIII with his 6 wives. But when you think about Andrew Jackson, we've had nowhere near that level of Jackson.
And with that, I just again recommend the Lindsey Graham podcast. I put some in the chat. There are 3 that I like: are American Elections, Wicked Game, 1865, and American History Tellers. So I would check out those.
I'll retweet this and tag him in it because I follow him, and then it'll get to retweet us and get people to watch us.
Oh yeah, that's great. So yeah, that's really the end. Wrapping up this first episode. All of the episodes are going to be of similar length, but I think this was a great show. We had lots of good discussion. So thank you to Eric and Sarah for coming on. And next week we'll be back with John Adams.
Bye.
Yeah.